of history was that there was no understanding. That is a prelude to correct action. But once you have understanding, there's still that gap between what is understood to be required and what is done. I spoke at the White House about the importance of the latest round of the UN Security Council resolutions against Iran, as well as the recent congressional sanctions bill signed by President Obama last week. The UN sanctions are important because they send a message to that regime that the international community, led by President Obama, stands firmly against Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. sanctions are important because they have more bite. And the sooner they're implemented and the more rigorously they're enforced, the more bite they will have. And I hope that other countries in Europe and elsewhere will follow with tough sanctions, particularly those that target Iran's energy sector. The regime is vitally dependent on that. But I think that we cannot be sure that these sanctions will have the necessary effect of stopping Iran's nuclear program. And therefore, I appreciated President Obama's statement that he is determined to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and that all options are open. I think to fully translate understanding into action, we must address the question of whether the world can live with a nuclear Iran. For a lot of influential people, and I suppose for some of the people here today, a nuclear-armed Iran would certainly be a danger, but perhaps I think it wouldn't be a new danger. After all, the Soviets had nuclear weapons. They were contained. So too, it is argued, a nuclear-armed Iran could be also contained. But the Soviet Union is far different, and was far different from what we see today in Iran. The Soviets certainly had global ideological ambitions, but in international affairs, they acted with supreme rationality. Every time the Soviets were faced with a choice between their ideology and their survival, they chose survival in Berlin, in Cuba, and elsewhere. And to the best of my knowledge, there were not many Soviet suicide bombers. The Iranian regime is different. They're driven by a militant ideology that is based on an entirely different set of values, a value system that may seem entirely irrational to us, but is pervasive, very powerful among those competing for leadership among the Islamic militants. Look at what happened nearly a decade ago in another part of this militant world. The Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda, operating on its soil, to dispatch terrorists to bomb New York, this city, and to bomb Washington. Now, what were they thinking? Did they think that the greatest power in the world would simply ignore mass destruction in its cities? Did they think that the United States of America would ignore an attack on its financial center, on its military headquarters, on its capital city? Were they that stupid? Or were they instead driven not by cool reason, but by a fiery fanaticism that overcomes normal logic? Iran sends children into minefields. Iran denies the Holocaust. Iran openly calls for Israel's destruction. Iran empowers Hezbollah with rockets and has overtaken half of Lebanon. Iran empowers Hamas with rockets, has overtaken Gaza and half of the Palestinian polity. Iran has sent saboteurs and terrorist squads into Egypt. Iran sends tentacles into the Yemen and threatens directly Saudi Arabia. Iran sends weapons into South America. This is what they do today when they don't have nuclear weapons. Think of what they will do tomorrow when they do have them. It is very hard for modern men and women to come to terms with the role of irrationality in human affairs. We tend to think that people and states are driven solely by interests, by a sober calculation of cost and benefit. We must recognize that those who glorify death and those who dispatch hordes of suicide bombers are not driven by grievances which can be addressed or by a despair which can be alleviated. We must recognize that there are wide-eyed, true believers, even mad believers in the world. There are fanatics who subscribe to a twisted creed, and they're willing to pay any price for its realization. And they're driven by a fervent hope that they will succeed at any price. Shakespeare advises to see the method in the madness. But facing today's militants in the greater Middle East, we should be well advised to see the madness in the method, to recognize that not everyone is constrained by the calculus of cost and benefit that has been associated with nuclear weapons, to recognize that some people, organizations, and regimes might act in ways that no one has acted since the advent of the era of nuclear peace that has followed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We must not allow the world's most dangerous regimes to possess the world's most dangerous weapons. This is the single greatest challenge of our time, and we must not fail to address it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd actually like to begin where you began, with the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I got a lot of emails before this meeting, and particularly at the time of the Gaza flotilla incident, and several of them struck the theme that Israel now had become more of a strategic liability to the United States than a strategic asset. So my question is how do you refute this, particularly for Americans who have come of age since 1967 and see Israel more as a victor than a victim?
There are several questions in your question, so
I violated my own rule, I'm sorry.
Well, what politicians simply do is they choose one of the things they want to answer. But I can address all of them if you wish. First of all, it's better to be a victor than a victim. If you're a victim, this was the condition of the Jewish people for several thousand years. We were the perfect victims. We were always morally perfect. And the minute you enter the stage of history and you actually have a state and you have to defend yourselves against rocketeers and they're embedded in civilian populations and you try to seek them out, and you do perhaps less than 1% of the damage done by another democracy, Britain, when it tried to respond to rocketeers on its cities, you're still held to an impossible standard, what I call the triple standard. There's one standard for the democracies, one standard for the dictatorships. They have their own standard. One standard for the democracies, and there's still a third standard for the democracy called Israel. So the only thing that I can say is we can put forward the truth of our case. We're the only country threatened with annihilation. We're the only country which has been rocketed by thousands of rockets and suicide bombers and attacked by sundry other means. We seek a genuine peace. We showed that. We were willing to make concessions for peace that no victor in any war has done, and we're ready to make those concessions, far-reaching concessions today, and the best way to test that is to actually test us, to actually get into those negotiations. So that's That's the first part. The second question you ask is Israel's, not its moral position, but its utility, strategic utility. The most unstable part of the world begins west of India and stops somewhere in North Africa. There's a landmass there that is highly unstable, that has radical regimes bent on acquiring nuclear weapons, atomic bombs. They're failed states, they're failed pre-states. It's a large swath of shifting sand.